Bring in show music, please.
Hi, I'm CNBC producer Katie Kramer. Today on Squawk Pod. Support for capitalism has dropped to a new low among Americans. Florida Senator Rick Scott is still a believer, but he understands frustrations.
What government has done is made it very difficult for the poor to get ahead. The cost of everything has gone up, and a lot of it is government regulation. You can't get a permit. You can't start a business.
Ohio gubernatorial candidate Vivek Ramaswamy sees the rising interest in socialism as an opportunity for his party.
I want to see Republicans use this as a wake-up call to affirmatively make the case for capitalism itself.
And inside the vaccine agenda of the nation's highest healthcare official, Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr., Scott Gottlieb, former commissioner of the FDA, joins us.
I think Kennedy's at odds with both the president's ethos around these things and certainly members of the Senate.
Plus, special guests at the U.S. Open men's final, including President Trump.
The crowd, some of which was, applauding loudly and others were booing.
It's Monday, September 8th, 2025, a very special week for Squawk Box.
This is a program where things are unscripted. We're looking for news to break.
Very unscripted. There is no script, folks.
Squawk Pod begins right now.
Stand Becky by in 3, 2, 1. Cue it, please.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Squawk Box right here on CNBC. We're live from the NASDAQ market site in Times Square. I'm Becky Quick along with Andrew Ross Sorkin. Joe is out today. And yeah, Andrew, I did notice that the winner of the lottery came from either Texas or Missouri, so I knew it wasn't going to be you because you said you wouldn't tell us.
Oh, right.
If you won.
Yes, that's true.
So the only way I knew was that
a boy can dream, though. A boy can still dream. Even now, I
But I did look at that and I thought,
yeah.
Andrew didn't win.
Thanks.
Sorry.
I knew that was high on your news headlines of the morning.
Well, you said you weren't going to tell us.
That's true.
So then I was like, okay, process of elimination. Pretty sure that's not him.
Meantime, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent rejecting the idea that the U.S. is in a jobs recession. He spoke with NBC's Meet the Press following Friday's employment report showing just 22,000 jobs were created in August. Here's what he had to say.
We're not going to do economic policy off of one number. We believe that good policies are in place that are going to create good, high-paying jobs for the American people.
On President Trump's tariffs, Secretary Bessent saying he's confident the Supreme Court will uphold the levies. If not, he said the refunds that the U.S. would have to offer would be, in his words, terrible for the Treasury.
One of President Trump's potential picks to be the next Fed chair making a call for central bank independence. National Economic Council Director Kevin Hassett appearing on CBS's Face the Nation. He was asked about CBS polling showing a majority of Republicans want the Fed to be guided by what President Trump wants. Here's Hassett's response to that.
If I were in that survey, then I would say 100% that monetary policy, Federal Reserve monetary policy, needs to be fully independent of political influence.
Including from President Trump.
Including from President Trump.
Hassett noting countries in which leaders have taken over central banks have seen inflation and consumer hardship, and probably worth pointing out, the president said over the weekend that it's back to 3 people. You know, all of this sound and fury about who was going to be considered, all of these different interviews that were taking place. Bessent has taken himself out of the whole thing, but it's Kevin Warsh, Kevin Hassett, and Waller, who are the 3 in the running for this.
I don't know if you saw in today's Wall Street Journal, Ken Griffin out with an op-ed publicly criticizing Trump. I mean, you talk about, it's actually the first time that I've seen a CEO criticize Trump as directly. I mean, we've always talked about, in the context, by the way, of Fed independence, just to read you what he said publicly criticizing the Fed, suggesting the dismissal of governors and pressuring the central bank to adopt a more permissive stance towards inflation carries steep costs, and goes on and on and on. But it's just interesting because we've talked about, this is something that most, I think, CEOs in America think is a problem, and yet there's been sort of almost a stunning silence for the most part from them directly.
Last week.
And so to see Ken out there today is pretty interesting. Meanwhile, if you
by the way, he's generally supported Republicans, I believe.
He's actually such an interesting Republican because he's supported Republicans, and yet even once President Trump won, he was one of the few CEOs who said, there are things that he does that I don't like. So it's been interesting. Kevin Hassett. I was also going to say Secretary Besson out with his own paper over the weekend, or on maybe on Friday, talking about how he thinks the Fed actually needs to narrow its mandate and shift what it actually does, which is a whole other story, because there's people at the Fed, of course, who think that it's important that they have these regulatory functions and other component parts.
He has spoken out about that, I think even on this show, the Treasury Secretary, when he's been on in the past, the idea that he would like to narrow the mandate. He talked about it, I believe, in the last month or so on our show, maybe the last 6 weeks, where he doesn't want them to get involved in some of the things that he thinks are pretty far afield from the two mandates that the Fed actually holds. So kind of crystallizing what he'd hinted at a lot before.
Right. I should tell you, I went to tennis yesterday, but interestingly, Besson was in the box with Trump, who was in the box with Bondi, but sitting next to Besson, Yasser from Saudi.
Okay.
Sort of an interesting watch for everybody. President Donald Trump spent his Sunday, as we just mentioned, at the U.S. Open in New York. He was greeted with a mixed reaction. The crowd, some of which was applauding loudly, and others were booing. The crowd, as he stepped out of the president's box before the match, many seats in the stadium were empty at the time due to enhanced security checks. This happened. There was two times he sort of that there was sort of cheers and other things going on. There were a lot of security checks. It delayed the game by half an hour. Really? I was in the line as well. There was a lot of security. Trump joined by a few other notable people at Arthur Ashe, including, as we mentioned earlier, well, we'll go through this list here. Attorney General Pam Bondi, and then his press secretary, Jared Kushner, of course, there. His daughter sharing the president's game box, and Special Envoy Steve Witkoff seen sitting next to the president. Notably, the president was in the box of Swiss giant Rolex. The Trump administration hit Switzerland with some of the biggest of the worldwide tariffs, so we imagine there might have been some pleas around tariffs in that box going on. But they did bring out the trophy. I don't think we said that Besson was there, but as I said, if we panned a little farther over, Yasser sat next to Scott the whole time, and there were a whole bunch of Wall Street folks who I think were clocking that. But by the way, putting aside this piece of it, it was a hell of a match. It really was. And by the way, the president stayed to the bitter end. Really? And watched the ceremony at the end and everything else, and stood the entire time.
That's good, because it would have caused a real interruption had they left mid.
And, there had been these reports that the Tennis Association had told ABC that if there's booing of the president, you're not to air it, or this or that. Report. I don't know about any of that. There was a bunch of times. The first time he came out, and maybe there were less people in the stadium, you did hear apparently there was some booing, but there was another period of time where he seemed to step out, and it was very loud. So I think there were some people who were cheering him. There were some people right below him that seemed to be very excited.
Which, by the way, it's generally a pretty quiet place too. You can hear just about anything that happens there, even when somebody makes a comment, because of the way the stadium.
Yes, no, this was what. No, but this would be like when the whole place erupted one way or the other, and I don't think you could get a full.
I'm just saying, if somebody wanted to heckle, you could in a place like that where it was quiet at some point.
Yes, there wasn't. Actually, that's true. So throughout the whole match, there was nobody stopping, screaming out, Trump, this or that.
You'd get kicked out immediately. Right. But you could have your moment if you wanted to, and that didn't happen.
Yeah.
Relatives of the Trump administration official who has accused Fed Governor Lisa Cook of mortgage fraud have reportedly themselves listed 2 properties in separate states as their primary residence. Reuters says that Mark and Julie Pulte, who are the father and stepmother of Federal Housing Finance Agency Director Bill Pulte, have claimed housing exemptions for homes in Michigan and Florida since 2020. That could save them thousands of dollars a year. Last week, ProPublica reported that at least 3 of the president's cabinet members call multiple homes their primary residences on mortgages. Bill Pulte has been leading a campaign against Fed Governor Lisa Cook for weeks over alleged mortgage fraud. President Trump fired Cook last month. She is currently fighting her termination, and that case is now in court. Probably worth pointing out that this is not a case, the Reuters story is not a case of mortgage fraud with the banks. This is a case where they were claiming homestead exemption claims, which are state-based claims. You can face fines and back pay and penalties that come up for something like this. It is not something that Bill Pulte at the FHFA would have any authority over because these are state violations. It's different than what he is accusing Lisa Cook of doing, which is, you could spend some time, I think, in prison with some of these mortgage fraud claims. Still, a lot of people looking and claiming second homes as their primary residence. It happens a lot, particularly in Washington, and there's definitely a spotlight on any activity like this at this point.
Lots more to think about.
Up next on Squawk Pod, different solutions to the same affordability crisis. Capitalism versus socialism, with two staunch capitalists, Florida Senator Rick Scott and Ohio gubernatorial candidate Vivek Ramaswamy. They're looking for national clues in 2025's local elections, like in New York City.
Let me go compete. Let me in the game, but you don't even let me in the game if you don't start out rich.
Think about housing as an example of this, too. I mean, he's running Mamdani here in New York, and many people across the country would be smart to run on bringing down the cost of housing.
We'll be right back. Welcome back. This is Squawk Pod, celebrating 30 years of Squawk Box. Here's Becky Quick and Andrew Ross Sorkin.
All this week, we are celebrating the 30th anniversary of Squawk Box, and we're going to start this morning with a look back at the very first show. It was a mission statement from the late, great Mark Haynes, and it's a mission that we try and uphold here every morning.
I'm Mark Haynes. This is Squawk Box, a program like none you've ever seen before. Our goal is to give you an edge as Wall Street begins the market day. We'll take you behind the scenes on Wall Street as major traders stake out their positions. We'll take you live to the floor of the New York Stock Exchange.
Again, that is the late, great Mark Haynes. That was the very first Squawk Box. We are celebrating our 30th anniversary this week, although I think they actually launched in August, so we're just past 30 years
a little bit
at this point. Mark laid it out from the very get-go. We try and do things differently here. This is a program where things are unscripted. We're looking for
Very
news to break.
Very
We're
unscripted.
looking
There
to
is
talk
no
about
script,
things
folks. People think that there's a script.
There's
Sometimes.
a rough script. We rarely follow it, but there is a rough script there. But again, this is 30 years in the making now. And that first show, that was, Joe Kernan, and who's been here through the entire thing.
Yep.
He's not here today, but he's been here through the entire part for this. David Faber on the show back then. You think
the brain.
The people who have gone through the program, from Maria Bartiromo to Carl Quintanilla. And here we are today.
Here we are.
But
here we are
we're going to be
30 years
celebrating
later.
all of this week, bringing back a lot of big guests, and just trying to stay true to that mission that's always been here, that we follow the news, we ask the questions, and we're on the fly, kind of running with things. And I thought our music was bad now.
Well, that's what, I don't know if people heard you. You said, I thought our opening now was cheesy. This is a little bit different, but
we've come a long way.
It's all good. It's an amazing thing, and it's a privilege to be part of something that has now been around for 30
There's the music
years.
Again.
There it is.
Dance to it.
You can dance to it. There you go. New Gallup poll released this morning finding that Americans' positive image of capitalism has fallen to a new low. Just 54% of U.S. adults surveyed view capitalism positively. That's down from 60% in 2021. It's the lowest level since Gallup began asking that question in 2010. Our next guests are here in New York City today to talk about New Yorkers, about what they say are the dangers of socialism, and to share their ideas on how to manage their future if Mamdani becomes the next mayor of New York City. We just had, of course, Governor Cuomo, who's running for mayor. Florida Senator Rick Scott is here, and Ohio gubernatorial candidate Vivek Ramaswamy. Good morning to both of you.
Good morning.
Morning.
Capitalism is good. Socialism is bad.
Okay, so
if you like capitalism, move to Florida. When Vivek is the governor, he's going to make it a place where you want to move to Ohio.
Okay, so the big question, though, is you look at these polls and you look at, even just the Democratic race here in New York City and the way the numbers seem to, and there's clearly a major gap in terms of the favorability and view of capitalism. Mm-hmm. And what that is, what do you think that actually is about? To the degree that you believe it's a misunderstanding or a miseducation or a miss-something, how you go about fixing that beyond us having this conversation?
We're going to go talk about opportunity. I'm a kid that grew up under capitalism. I grew up in public housing, never known my natural father. And I had the opportunity in this country to go build companies and eventually run for governor and run for the Senate. That's what we ought to be talking about. The fact that you can come from anywhere in this country and do something. Under socialism, that's clearly not true.
I do think it's a fact of the matter. My parents came to this country as legal immigrants 4+ decades ago. They never imagined I'd go on to found multi-billion-dollar companies, now running to be the governor of the very state where I was born and raised. And the extraordinary thing about our country is that Rick Scott's story, my story, are actually not that extraordinary in the United States, that this is the country on God's green earth where that's possible. Now, beyond just talking about it, I think we have to put some more meat on the bone as well when it comes to participating in equity ownership. And I think this is the big difference between the wealthy and everybody else, is do you participate in the uncapped upside that capitalism creates? And I think the left with baby bonds and universal basic income, they have a shred of an intuition that they channel in totally the wrong way. What I want to focus on, and what we're going to do in Ohio, is incorporate financial literacy starting at a young age. Engage in what Albert Einstein called the most powerful force in the universe, compound interest, starting young, where I want to build a state where every kid who's born, raised, living, and working in Ohio grows up to be a millionaire in our state. The best way to combat the popularity of socialism, Andrew, is actually to make everyone a capitalist by making them an owner in those uncapped upside equity accreting assets.
Here's the question, though. So here in New York, one of the things that Mamdani seems to have been able to capture is this idea of affordability being a problem.
Because it is a problem.
Because it is a problem. It's a genuine, real problem. And I think it's not just a problem here in New York. I think it's a problem across the whole country. And there are so many families that literally are just scraping to get by every week, every month, every day. You know, you and I went to the U.S. Open yesterday. Yep. It's a fabulous event. And the truth is, most people in America cannot afford to go to something like that. They can't afford to actually go to an NFL game necessarily. They can watch it on TV. And as a result, I think there is this view of this sort of haves and have-nots thing that's happened in this country, and how you can create a sort of better system. I don't know if it's a better system, but a better system ultimately.
And there's clearly
for this to work.
Right, it's what government has done is made it very difficult for the poor to get ahead. The cost of everything has gone up, and a lot of it is government regulation. You can't get a permit. You can't start a business. You can't even get ahead. So if you think my first business was a donut shop, I just got out of the Navy. You know how many permits I had to have? None. I didn't have to have one permit. Right? Today, it would take you months. And in New York City, it's probably worse than almost any place in the country. So if you think about what we've done and how we've hurt the poor, you made it very difficult because of regulations and permits and fees, and you have to have this standard, and you have to have this test, and you have to have this degree, you have to have this. Let me go compete. Let me in the game, but you don't even let me in the game if you don't start out rich.
Think about housing as an example of this, too. I mean, he's running Mamdani here in New York, and many people across the country would be smart to run on bringing down the cost of housing. You want to bring down the cost of housing? Rent controls aren't the way to do it. The way to do it is increase the supply of what actually matters. Increase the supply of new home construction. What gets in the way? Rent restrictions, land use restrictions, red tape in the way. Think about energy. Electricity costs in my part of the country are 50% higher this summer than they were last summer. How do you solve the problem? Increase the supply of energy production. And yet a lot of those far left policies, while well intended for the best of them, are actually resulting in hurting the very people they intended to help by creating higher housing and energy
Vivek,
costs.
that's why there's a lot of people who say Mamdani would be the perfect solution. Let him get elected. Let people see what happens when you have some of these far left solutions. Do you agree with that?
So I think electorally, I mean, out of taking my self-interest out of it, I'm running in the 26th cycle. I think Republicans will undoubtedly do better if Mamdani is elected, which appears to be on track to happen. I'm not rooting for that because I think that New York City is a great American city, and we want to see New York City thrive and set a positive example rather than a negative one. That being said, some lessons do end up having to be learned the hard way. And you want to combat the popularity of socialism? Well, if you see the result of those socialist policies, people are going to be open to a different alternative. What I want to see, Becky, though, is I want to see Republicans use this as a wake-up call to affirmatively make the case for capitalism itself. The original version.
Okay, so now
and if we do that, we're going to be successful.
I have a complicated question for both of you. We are now in a very unique moment in the Republican Party, at least in what Trump's Republican Party, around the idea of what capitalism and free markets are. You look at the transaction that took place with Intel, what's happening potentially with AMD and NVIDIA. We can go down the line when it comes to industrial policy, tariffs and the like. These are not considered free market principles at all. In fact, some people would describe these as socialist principles. What say you?
Well, let's take Intel as an example, okay? They got, I think, $4 billion out of the CHIPS Act. I completely oppose the CHIPS Act. So here what we said is, Intel, you get $4 billion. You don't have to actually operate a plant. You can still, and the CEO of Intel said, I asked him in a hearing, are you going to keep doing business in China? Yeah. I said, if they invade Taiwan, you're going to keep doing business in China? Absolutely. So if you look at what's happened is, whether any of us would believe, right, that you should get, interest in a company, if that's the way we're going to get a return on the $4 billion we put up, if that's the only way we're going to get a return, then we ought to get a return. But look, I did economic development when I did as governor, okay? And I did it I said, I will help you, but it's tied to how much do you pay, how many jobs you create, do you keep those jobs? That's what we should be doing. And that's not what happened with the CHIPS Act.
Well, where do you land on that? Just because it is an interesting phenomenon. We are in an industrial policy world. By the way, this could be busting the myth that there are free markets at all. I mean, some people would argue under Democrats there wasn't a free market either, insofar as there were either giveaways or grants or other things for different industries. I mean, we can go down that line, but it's a different approach.
Well, here's what I'll say, Andrew. The modern Republican Party is a big tent coalition. I have my views within that coalition. I believe that capitalism is the best system known to the history of man to lift people up from poverty. And I give President Trump for unifying what is a big tent coalition. Now, to pick up where Senator Scott left off on the CHIPS Act, I'll give you my perspective. I think the CHIPS Act was a mistake. It was based on this false premise that we're trying to imitate China, where China showered a bunch of semiconductor companies with money. Didn't go very well. They're being investigated for corruption, which is the sign that it failed. In the U.S., we shouldn't copy that method by having showered them as we did under the Biden administration. But let's get to the root cause. Why is TSMC slowing down a little bit in Arizona, or not as fast as they would have wanted to be? It's in part because we don't exactly have yet the skilled workers to build those sub-10 nanometer leading edge semiconductors, which goes back to deeper root causes that I'm looking to address in our educational system. I mean, the average student right now in the United States is 4 full academic years behind the average student in China. A 7th grader here is performing at the same academic standard as a 3rd grade student in China. That's unacceptable. And do we need leaders, frankly, if not in the Democratic Party, at least in the Republican Party, focusing on those root causes? Absolutely. And I think we're going to be unified around that. But certainly in Ohio, looking at state leadership, that's where my focus remains.
Unfortunately, we're out of time. This is a longer conversation. We could do a whole episode, if not longer.
We could do a whole day
spend all
on
3
this.
days on this. I want to thank Senator Rick Scott for being with us. Vivek Ramaswamy, thank you for being with us as well. As we head to a break, another Squawk 30 moment. Do you remember where you were when the Dow hit 10,000?
I believe we've just broken 10,000. Let's go.
10,000 has been touched, and it was certainly a bit of celebrating. Now everybody's pretty much back to business. Mark, back to you.
Okay, for a minute there, I thought we weren't going to make it on our show, but tradition has once again been upheld, and the 1,000 mark, the millennium mark, falls while Squawk Box is on the air.
Cheese will be next.
Coming up next on Squawk Pod, former FDA Commissioner Dr. Scott Gottlieb on Health and Human Services Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. asking questions about vaccine requirements.
Well, it's not the questions he's raising, it's the instruments he's putting in place to start restricting access to vaccines.
And we're back. This is Squawk Pod as we celebrate 30 years of Squawk Box on CNBC, like the time NVIDIA CEO Jensen Huang stopped by the set on his way somewhere else. Live TV, folks.
Wait.
Say hello.
How is the camera not getting?
Can we get a better camera angle? Here, see who's here.
He's here just to...
Cameo
He's doing
appearance.
some other stuff here. But
We don't have a microphone on you is a problem.
Well, it's so exciting to be on the air. Am I on TV?
You're on TV.
That's incredible. I'm with Becky.
With the greatest show, the greatest show in the world.
This is the greatest show on earth.
Joining us right now to talk about what we're seeing in Washington, covering health and human services, is Dr. Scott Gottlieb. He is the former FDA commissioner and a CNBC contributor who's also an Illumina and Pfizer board member. And Dr. Gottlieb, I want to talk to you a little bit today about what we saw last week in the hearings with RFK Jr. In fact, let's listen in. Republican senators expressing some dismay at Senator Kennedy's words at last week's hearings in front of the Finance Committee We've heard from Senators Barrasso and Tillis in the hearing, and in fact, here's what they both had to say.
Secretary Kennedy, in your confirmation hearings, you promised to uphold the highest standards for vaccines. Since then, I've grown deeply concerned.
I do also believe that some of your statements seem to contradict what you said in the prior hearing. You said you're going to empower the scientists at HHS to do their job. I'd just like to see evidence where you've done that.
Senator Mike Rounds of South Dakota, for his part, told reporters, I'm telling my kids, I'm telling my family members and anybody who asks my opinion, get your vaccines. They have saved millions of lives. And when he was asked if he had second thoughts about voting to confirm Robert F. Kennedy Jr. as Health and Human Services Secretary, Rounds said, I think the president wanted him, and I think the president has to deal with him. That's a lot of voices, Dr. Gottlieb, who are now raising questions on the Republican side. And I just wonder how much tolerance the president, you think, will have for an agenda that may not necessarily reflect his own.
Yeah, look, I think the president seems to be supportive of Kennedy. I think what you're seeing on the Hill is mounting frustration around the moves on the pediatric vaccine schedule. I think a lot of people who had frustrations coming out of COVID about both the mandates as well as the disclosures of information around that vaccine, where people felt that the CDC was slow to service certain information, wanted some kind of reckoning, but they didn't want a reckoning around the pediatric vaccine schedule, which is what RFK seems to be after right now. I think a lot of the policy steps he's taken is setting up an outcome where he's going to try to restrict access to the pediatric vaccines. You're seeing on the Hill, there's not a lot of tolerance for that. And you heard the president's comments as well, affirming the importance of that pediatric schedule.
The president's comments, I think you're referring to when he was talking about Florida, where there is a movement afoot to say that there are no more mandatory vaccines, including for kids going to school. The president himself said, and I'm just looking for this at this point, you have some vaccines that are so incredible. He said this at the White House when he was asked about that effort in Florida. And I think you have to be very careful when you say that some people don't have to be vaccinated. I think you're right. There were a lot of questions about the COVID vaccine, people wondering how safe, especially for kids. Some questions just going back, this was something that was done in a rush. Can we ask some of those questions without upending every vaccine that we've ever developed and put forward?
Yeah, look, and the president's comments reflect my conversations with him. I had many opportunities to talk to the president about vaccines, probably 6 in all, which is a lot of conversations for an FDA commissioner to be having with the president. He had good questions. He had some furtive concerns. He wanted to make sure we were looking at the data. He wanted to make sure we have good systems in place to monitor the safety of vaccines. Some of his questions were around the purported link between autism and the MMR vaccine, because there was a lot of stuff in the press. But the president always affirmed the importance of the pediatric schedule. And the few times that he went out and spoke publicly about this forcefully, it was always to encourage people to get vaccinated. During the 2019 outbreak of measles in New York City in the Orthodox community, the president went out and said it was very important for children to get that vaccine. During the 2018 flu season, when we had a very bad flu season, he went out and tried to encourage senior citizens to get vaccinated. So the president was always supportive. He had good questions. They were the kind of questions you would encounter with, a parent. But they were not the kinds of questions we're seeing raised by Secretary Kennedy. And I think Kennedy's at odds with both the president's ethos around these things and certainly members of the Senate.
What questions is Kennedy raising that are different, you think, than what President Trump raised?
Well, it's not the questions he's raising. It's the instruments he's putting in place to start restricting access to vaccines, getting control of the ACIP committee at CDC. He's going to put on the next agenda the hepatitis B vaccine, we all know. He's looking at MMRV vaccine, trying to obviate use of the MMRV vaccine, which is measles, mumps, rubella, and varicella. I believe he's going to claim in his autism report that there's an association between alum, which is the adjuvant used in most pediatric vaccines, and autism, which is going to set in place a litigation enterprise against the vaccines to potentially bankrupt the vaccine injury compensation program. So that could take down the whole pediatric vaccine enterprise. And he's been very systematic, very methodical, frankly, very effective, putting in place the people and the tools he needs to try to effectuate this goal. Look, he is an avowed anti-vaxxer. He spent 2 decades doing this. Sometimes you have to take people at their word. I think this is a mission of his, and there really hasn't been a lot of pushback until now, and this is mostly rhetorical pushback. No one's really stopped him from implementing these instruments of control.
When you say bring down the entire pediatric vaccine schedule, what do you mean?
Well, look, if he makes a move to say that there is a purported link between alum and the entire pediatric schedule, that adjuvant's used in about 10 vaccines is no good alternative. He could force the vaccine manufacturers to try to reformulate the vaccines, decouple them. So instead of having MMR, you have measles, mumps, and rubella separately. Remember, we're in a situation right now, we're seeing declining vaccination rates. Last year, we had 35,000 cases of pertussis. The year before, it was 5,000. This year, we're expecting upwards of 75,000. So you're starting to see the vaccination rates declining, and you're starting to see the implications of that in terms of more disease. I think he's going to systematically go after, try to force manufacturers to reformulate and decouple some of these vaccines. One of the things they did in the COVID approval that was interesting was a contraindicated co-administration between the COVID vaccine and flu and RSV. And as you know, I'm on the board of Pfizer.
Right.
There's a lot of data showing that COVID could be safely administered with flu. In fact, the CDC website still recommends that. They created a new evidentiary standard they called substantial clinical benefit. They're saying you have to prove substantial clinical benefit in order to demonstrate that two vaccines could be co-administered. They did this in the context of COVID. If you extend this, not to an extreme, but just to sort of its logical next step, why wouldn't they call into question co-administration of the pediatric schedule and say you have to demonstrate that there's substantial benefit to co-administering these? If they did
There's a
that,
substantial benefit if you're a parent because you don't want your kid to get jabbed four times instead of one for the MMRV.
a lot of what we do with the pediatric schedule is to try to conform with the practice of pediatrics, because you can only bring a baby back so many times for a well baby visit. If they start to decouple these things and force a lot of more interactions with the healthcare system, it's going to put pressure on vaccination rates overall. Right. You want to get them over with, but it's going to cause a lot of people not to get those vaccines.
Them at all.
Yeah, they'll be lost to follow-up.
Scott, you bring up, you're on the board at Pfizer. Critics are going to say, oh, you're just saying this because you're defending Pfizer and defending their vaccine business. What's your response to that?
Well, look, a lot of what we're talking about here is not made by Pfizer. The only pediatric vaccine that Pfizer makes is the pneumonia vaccine. So if you look at alum, for example, it's in Hib, it's in meningitis, it's in hepatitis B, it's in a lot of other vaccines. It's not in that the Pfizer particular vaccines. Pfizer does make the COVID vaccine, but I think, frankly, we've kind of settled in an environment right now where that vaccine is largely going to be used by an older population. My biggest concern are the pediatric vaccines, MMR, pertussis, DTaP. That's what I think Kennedy's focusing on.
And for the Republicans who are raising questions, and again, it's also been Senator Cassidy from Louisiana, a Republican, who's a doctor, and Barrasso, who is not only the second-ranking Republican in the Senate, but a doctor. With them raising questions, does that change the stakes?
I don't think it changes the stakes a whole lot, quite frankly. I think this really needs to be from the White House, and the question is, where is the president on a lot of these things? This certainly puts pressure on the secretary. I think potentially slows them down a little bit, makes them think twice about doing things like firing the CDC director, things that are very visible. But a lot of what's happening that's going to be most impactful is this stuff underneath the radar, what I'm talking about now, the alum, and declaring that it's the cause of autism.
I was just going to ask you, politically, do you think that RFK is going to remain in this job for the duration of Trump's term?
I think he's going to remain in the job as long as he wants, quite frankly. I don't see any real groundswell in the White House from what I'm hearing that RFK, is an albatross around the administration, needs to leave.
Except that I don't think that they like some of the vaccine, except that they seem to be at odds on some of the vaccine stuff a little bit, but maybe they're really not at odds.
Yeah, but so look at talc. So FDA held panels on talc trying to link talc to certain chronic diseases. They backed off that immediately because a lot of manufacturers went to the White House with concerns, and the White House, I think, encouraged RFK and others to back away from that. And it wasn't just the drug companies. These were cosmetic manufacturers. You could see situations where there's pressure to back off certain of these vectors. I think the vaccines, though, is so part and parcel to the secretary's ethos. I have a hard time believing he's going to back away from there. And the other thing is that, that hearing was combative. But I think a lot of people go into hearings right now in this administration of the view that they do better when they're combative. I think he overreached a little. I think he overreached a little bit because I think showing disrespect, particularly to any member of Congress, but especially your own party, is risky. But that is the general posture of people who go before the Senate. Unfortunately, right now, that they feel that they need to be combative if they're going to be facing, a hostile hearing.
Okay. Dr. Gottlieb, thank you.
Thanks a lot.
That is Squawk Pod for this Monday. Thanks for starting your week with us here. Please listen all week as we mark Squawk Box's 30th anniversary, on the air weekday mornings since 1995. Our show is hosted by Joe Kernan, Becky Quick, and Andrew Ross Sorkin. This podcast is produced by me, Katie Kramer, and Cameron Costa. Follow Squawk Pod anywhere you like to listen to get the very best of our 3-hour morning show in a podcast you can take with you. That's it. We'll meet you right back here tomorrow.
We are clear. Thanks, guys.